Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the session on historic preservation. I'm Howard Katz, and I'm a professor at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. I'll be the moderator for this session. I'm sure we would all agree that Jim is entitled to a short break. So, historic preservation is usually not the first thing people think about when they think about land banks. But land banks can be a valuable tool in the process of preserving and adaptively reusing historic properties. We have two speakers with us in this session who will share their experiences from two different perspectives. Heather Rudge is the founder and owner of HP Group, a historic preservation consulting firm. Jessica Powell is the vice president of the Hamilton County Land Reutilization Corporation, the Hamilton Land Bank. Both of them have very impressive backgrounds relevant to today's topic, so I urge you to check out their full bios on the conference website. Before the two speakers, we are going to watch two videos that will show some of the projects where land banks were vital to the process of restoring historic buildings. The first video will show projects in the Cleveland area. The second video will show projects in the Cincinnati area. Then we will hear from our two panelists, and then after they both speak, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers using the Q&A function. So first, we will watch the two videos.
We're here in Cleveland's Tremont neighborhood in front of what used to be St. Vladimir's Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And I'm here with Heather Rudge, who's with the Historic Preservation Group and played a critical role in helping to repurpose this once historic church, and still historic, but now it'll be used for something different. Can you tell us about this project, Heather?
Sure. This is a historic tax credit project. The property was purchased a couple of years ago by Olympic Products. It's a company that makes pallets and custom shipping containers, and this is going to be converted to their corporate offices.
Neat. How big? How many square feet?
About 22,000 square feet.
It's a lot of room.
Yeah, there's the church, there's a basement, balcony, and then there's a rectory on the back. So
will they be using most of it?
They're using the whole thing.
The whole thing.
So
Neat.
Offices, open office in the basement fellowship hall, open offices in the sanctuary space with conference rooms in both locations, conference space, room space on the balcony, and then private offices in the rectory.
Now, the size, you got a historic tax credit for this.
Historic tax credits.
How large?
About 800,000 for federal and 250. We went into the small project category for the state, so we got 250.
I know we'll be getting into this in the discussion later, but just give me an idea of what some of the criteria are that would enable you to apply for historic tax credits federally and state tax credits.
Well, the property has to be listed on the National Register if to qualify for both the federal and the state. They could also be, for the state credit, you could also have a property that's locally landmarked. Perhaps if you were only going for state tax credits. This property is in the Tremont Historic District, and that's been listed for probably 20 years. The Tremont Historic District is both a local district and a National Register district. So,
start to finish, how long did this project take?
With COVID delays, it's been a little bit longer, so it's been a couple years.
Great.
And they'll be finished this fall.
Oh, that's great. So, having seen this project, what a cool project. We're up on the third floor of the rectory will be the office of the CEO.
Correct.
In Ohio, as we travel around the state, we see, and I can't give you a number, many, many closed churches that offer possibilities for repurposing.
Exactly.
If they can't be houses of worship. And I realize they're all not in cities, some of them are in smaller towns, but what are some of the factors you would look at if you were advising one of the counties around Ohio about whether a church could be saved and repurposed?
Well, I think most churches, especially if they have a smaller footprint, a smaller square footage, like this church is not a massive sanctuary. The footprint is relatively small. So it makes a manageable space for people to adapt to a new use. In this case, office use throughout the whole complex. There's another church down the street that has a school, a church, and a rectory, and that's been repurposed for office. A single-use tenant in the sanctuary that uses it for their offices and their furniture showroom. I think it's one of the most dramatic office spaces in Cleveland. I'm doing another project in Lakewood, same thing. There's a church and education wing, and then 2 small commercial buildings. The commercial buildings will remain commercial, restaurant, retail. The church will be an office, and the education wing is going to be converted to housing. So there's a lot of opportunities for repurposing a church, especially if it's got a smaller footprint. A large church is probably a little bit more difficult, unless you repurpose it for office, a larger office, or maybe like an entertainment venue or something like that. But churches, offer a unique space and a real opportunity for reuse rather than demolishing the buildings.
So we're out front of what used to be a by right at the corner of Madison and Robin in Lakewood's historic Birdtown neighborhood. You are going to be taking what used to be the by right and converting it into 2 commercial spaces?
2 commercial spaces and 18 apartments on the 2nd and 3rd floors, and the house in the rear.
That rendering, by the way, forget the rendering. That's something the realtor had up.
Yes.
But this roof is going to be removed as well?
Yes, the pent roof will be removed across the east and the north elevations, and the storefront, the historic configuration, will be reinstated. There used to be an entrance at the face of the building where this inset entrance is over here, and there was a corner entrance that was inset that will also be reinstated.
And the house in the back, so the original building was built in
1918.
And the house was added later?
No, the house was built at the same time.
Also, it was the hardware store to the right that was added about 4 years later.
Yeah, in 1922. And the people who built the building lived in the house for a good number of years. And eventually, as the grocery stores, because it was a number of grocery stores, it was first an A&P, they broke through the first floor wall that separated the house and the commercial building, and they moved all their coolers
into what used to be the house.
The first floor of the house,
which will now become 4 units.
The house will be there'll be 2 units on the first floor that will have exterior entrances.
Right.
A unit on the 2nd floor, which will be accessed. There's going to be a new elevator and stair tower on the back.
Right. And this was never apartments.
It was never apartments.
The famous Lakewood Slovak Club, it was one of the largest ethnic groups in Lakewood, had the 2nd floor. What else was up on the 2nd floor? I see there used to be a dance studio.
Yeah, there was a party center there for a while. After the people who owned it originally sold it, there were a couple of furniture stores and furniture storage warehouse.
Wow. Up on the 2nd floor
with no elevator.
No elevator.
Yeah.
Well, those guys earned their keep when they took the furniture up and down.
Yeah.
And again, your time frame on this, you want to be open by when?
It'll be done in a year.
That's great.
Yeah.
Great.
Now
you have another project you did down the block. We're going to head there next.
We do.
Okay,
we do.
Great. So just 2 blocks away from the project that was the by right is the Veronica, and this was a project you also did.
Yes, this was done a couple years ago. It's a historic tax credit project. Both of these buildings are in the Birdtown Historic District, which made them eligible for tax credits. This one got about 66,000 in federal credits and about 82,000 in state credits. It was a smaller project, about $350,000.
And this obviously has downstairs commercial tenants?
It does. 1 tenant in both commercial spaces. And I don't know if people will remember this, but it had, the entire storefront was enclosed with rocks. It had no windows, and it had a pent roof similar to the roof that we just saw, but
At
it
the
was
old
shingles.
Byrite,
Yes,
yeah.
but it was shingles put up in the 1970s, so there was no daylight in the space. And when we started to pull that off, we discovered the historic transoms and the bulkheads where the storefront windows are. So we reinstated it. We used it as a model. This one was intact mostly, and that one was missing. So we just duplicated it from one side to the other.
What a beautiful building. Did you have to redo the brick? Did you anything?
Very little work on the brick. It was washed. It wasn't clean. It's a glazed brick, and the glaze is pretty sensitive to any chemical cleaning. But even though it's near Union Carbide's factories and stuff, it really wasn't that dirty.
Yeah.
So
well, as you might imagine, Ohio was filled. Thousands of buildings just like this.
exactly.
Ground floor retail,
on every
upstairs
main
apartment.
street, in every community. And this is a perfect example. The owner, because it was a smaller project, the owner of the building, who is also a contractor, is using the historic tax credits personally, both the state and the federal, which monetizes the credit. So he gets a dollar for dollar value rather than selling the credits for a discount.
So he's really using them.
He's using the credits. You take the federal credit, over 5 years, 4% of the credit a year, which is, if you have a business, it's very easy to use.
So hopefully people out there in the Land Bank Network will see a building like this that they have in their own county and they think there might be the potential and they can reach out.
Exactly. This building too, it always had 6 rental units in the second floor, and those spaces were maintained and just rehabilitated.
And they're still there, obviously.
Exactly.
Great. Thank you.
So we were approached by the city in 2017 because this property was literally falling down into the street and onto neighboring properties. At the time, it was pretty much of an emergency in terms of needing to get on site pretty quickly to assess the scope of work that would needed to be done in order to just stabilize the property, make it watertight, and make it safe for redevelopment. So out of that initial conversation, funding always is a question, like how do we pay for this? Historic stabilization is really, really expensive. So in our partnership with the city, they were able to provide most of the funds necessary to cover the stabilization costs of this property. And we entered into an agreement with them to deploy those funds to bring this property into a safer condition. State law is really unique for land banks because the legislation allows us to enter into agency agreements with jurisdictions to take care of blight. And I think many times those agency agreements will contemplate like demolition of a project or of a property. But what we've done a lot here in Cincinnati with our good inventory of historic blighted properties is we look to these instances to see, can we enter into an agency agreement with the city or with our jurisdictional partner in order to go into a property that is abandoned, we don't own it, but if we follow a proper due process and notice to the owners and to the lien holders to get in there and stabilize it to prevent further deterioration. And then once that's done, we work either with the owner to get some kind of reimbursement, but most of the time, again, the owner's out of the picture or not able to really pay for the costs to keep a building like this. And so what happens is we end up working with the county prosecutor's office to bring a property like this that at that point is going to be pretty significantly tax delinquent. And then from there, through the foreclosure process, we're able to deal with title issues and other things. So land banks exist to take on property that the private market really can't address on its own, either because the property is so underwater that you can't get traditional bank financing to fix it, or it's too risky because of the rehab cost for a private developer just to foot in front the entire cost to bring a property back into habitability. And so that's where, and that's why you have county land banks, port authorities, and jurisdictions really kind of problem solving together, because if you don't do that, nothing's gonna happen, right? Like the properties are just gonna stay in their current state They're going to continue to deteriorate. And you can hope that the surrounding market will help an abandoned building in and of itself gain value and for a private investor to come along, but that is rarely the case. So you need that intervention and that creative problem solving using kind of statutory tools and other creative resources to deal with a property like this and help kind of, as a result, the surrounding business district.
Well, this particular building was owned by one of our more notorious owners, let's say, to put it kind of politely. You know, when it was occupied up until around maybe 2013 or 12, it had, you know, it's just, the guy hasn't made any capital improvements to it. He had just constantly leaks, bad plumbing, electrical, all kinds of problems, you know. It got so bad it couldn't be lived in. We had to vacate it. So at that point we had to decide, okay, we got to do something with this thing. And one of the things about a city like this one is when we're competing with the suburbs, you know, they don't have these 100, 200-year-old buildings like we've got. And they're not going to for quite a while. And people like that. They like this kind of culture, and they like to walk down this street, for example, and feel a certain kind of sense of time and place. It's very different, and you just can't get that just anywhere. The city's got a lot of that, and we want to try to keep it if we can.
Do you remember what kind of stabilization fund? You've got the regular blight abatement, and then you've got a part of your funding, the CDBG for historic preservation.
So when we see them getting so bad, we're going to lose them. Then we have this little bit of money we can go in and get it from the precipice, pull it back, and get it restored, and maybe it'll get a future like a new lease on life like this building. The land bank is an excellent partner because they've got some tools in their toolbox. It's one thing to be able to go in and stabilize it, but then again, to get title to it is another matter. It can take, you know, 6 years or longer for the county through its normal processes to get around to foreclosing on this thing. And during that much time, it's not going to get any better. But with the land bank, they can do the expedited foreclosures, so they make an excellent partner to work with on these things to get title.
In any neighborhood you come into that, you know, that is coming back, that's been around for years, I think we need to be able to find the historic properties, especially that are on the main line, for multiple reasons. Number one, the character can never be replaced, right? These have been here for 100 years, and to Ed's point, you know, it's going to take another 100 years for buildings to get this old again. The second thing is there's 3 points, intrinsic beauty inside of these buildings. Just to look at it, you see it as a sense of history, of permanence. And then the third thing is, and this kind of goes back to, you know, something Ed said as well, is that it's very difficult to take a small and medium-sized property and create a new construction project in this day and age. Given the financing and construction costs inside of the market right now, it becomes very tricky. So to find a building like this, it's critical to find an old building in an emerging market, because you know that you can actually bring out that life that existed in it for years beforehand, and bring it back out to, you know, to the market. You will always start a project with the greatest of ideals, but you have to look at the numbers to figure out how projects are going to pan out. Because if it's not, to your point, if it's not sustainable, you're not only doing yourself a disservice, but you're doing the community a disservice as well. Like, you can walk through and I can pencil through 80% of what the project is going to look like, but that last 20%, that last 10% can make or break a deal in a heartbeat. So without the land bank being able to come in, work on these properties, stabilize these properties, and make sure that they are set up, they eliminate that last bit of risk and unknown for the developer to make the projects financeable and fungible. That's really, you know, an amazing thing that the land bank has done. So I'm really proud to have been working with you guys on that and being able to, you know, hopefully replicate this step.
Welcome back, everyone. Let's move on. And we're first going to hear from Heather Rudge, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the founder and owner of HP, which is a historic preservation consulting and she's going to talk about some of the issues that were raised by the first video and some of the issues that probably are on the minds of attendees about the intersection of land banking and historic preservation. Heather?
Thank you, Howard. Can everybody hear me, I hope? Howard, you can hear me? Okay. So I'm going to talk about utilizing historic tax credits as a potential alternative for demolishing properties. I learned from Jim Rakakis about the number of properties that have been demolished over the last years, sort of across the state. And perhaps some of the worst properties are gone, and perhaps some of the information you get today will allow you to think about the properties left in your community that still need to be addressed, but see them in a different way as potentially an asset to the community and the repurposing of those buildings as well. So this presentation is going to take a look at some property types that you may have in your community that have been saved in other communities and adaptively reused rather than being demolished. In all of the cases that I'm going to show you, the use of federal and state tax credits, with the exception of one, was just a state tax credit, but all the projects have used federal and state historic tax credits, and the use of the tax credits made the projects feasible. On each slide that you're going to see, it's going to provide the building square footage, the total project costs, the qualified rehabilitation expenses, and then the value of the federal and state historic tax credits amounts, which should give you a snapshot of what the value is the credits bring to a project. I'm not going to read all of that. You can see it, it's up on the screen. If you want to make notes and have specific questions about a project later, you can feel free to contact me. So with that, let's see. Oh, it does work. Okay, the automatic clicker works. So I'm going to ask the first polling question first, and actually it's popped up, so I guess you guys can answer that question. I don't even need to go through it. So I'm going to assume that I can move on because everybody has the polling question in front of them that needs it. Okay. Can we take the polling question down, or is that not possible yet? Can somebody give me an idea if we can take that down?
It's down on our screen, Heather.
Oh, okay. All right, very good. Okay. So I just want to give you the thumbnail sketch of federal and state historic tax credits. For a property to be eligible for federal credits, it has to be listed or be eligible to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places. It doesn't have to be listed at the start of a project. It just has to be listed by the end of the project. And the historic tax credit for the federal is 20%. If you follow the rules and you get your approvals, it's 20% of the rehabilitation expenses and soft costs, which are called the qualified rehabilitation expenditures. You sometimes see them referred to as QREs. The QREs, the simple way to think about it is if you picked up the building when it was done and you shook the building, everything that falls out of the building, like the furniture, appliances, that sort of thing, that is not a QRE, but anything that's fastened to the building is a QRE. So roof, any, walls, mechanical, electrical and plumbing, plus all of your soft costs. So all of your architecture, engineering, civil, historic preservation consultants, all of your consultants, that is also a rehabilitation cost. And that's what you get, that's the value that you get the tax credits on. The state historic tax credits has a little bit of a different requirement. The property has to be already listed on the National Register when you apply, or be locally landmarked when the application is submitted. And the value of the state allocation is 25% of the QREs. Typically, the state is very competitive. It's not a guarantee. You have to apply for it. You get the project is scored against the projects across the state, and not every project gets an award. There are 2 allocations per year. If you don't get an award in the first allocation, you can reapply. It's not a guarantee that you'll get it the second time, but it's out there as a tool. So the first group of buildings I want to talk about are small commercial buildings. This, you know, as we saw in the video, these are everywhere, you know, communities, and the you know, the need to deal with those on a variety of cases is fairly great. So the first building, this is the nest, which you saw in the video. I'll give you, here are the specifics on it, which you can see on the left-hand slide. This is going to be 2 commercial spaces on the ground floor, 18 residential units on the 2nd and 3rd floor, and there's a house, which you see in the slide at the rear, that is also going to house the residential units. The critical aspect of this is that some of the interior fit out was stripped back when we found historic tin ceilings. We're working with the historic fabric that remains, and we will reinstate the historic storefronts to make it look more like the Veronica, the orange brick building that you saw in the video. Here's the Veronica. I wanted to just show you this so you could envision what the owner and what we saw when we got to this project. The whole first floor was enclosed with stone and wood. It had a pent roof on it. And when we started to peel those alterations back, as you see in the second photo at the top, we found a bulkhead that was there from when the building was built. So we carefully, the demolition was very carefully done, and we were able to restore and replicate what was found under the alterations. And then the bottom left-hand side is just one of the apartment units. This building originally had 6 apartment units in it historically, and those spaces were, the divisions in those spaces remained, all the units were upgraded with new finishes. This is a really interesting project. This is done by the Lakewood Historical Society. They were gifted a old mid-century modern medical building for their new headquarters building. And it was a bit of a challenge working with a historical society because they're a not-for-profit. The state tax credit was used on this project, but not federal because the project was so small. Some of the reporting requirements for the federal credit on a project this small just don't make it worthwhile. So this building had about $90,000 in qualified rehabilitation expenses. That's what it ended up being. And the organization actually received a check because they got a refund because they don't pay taxes. They got a refund of $22,500 to put towards paying off the rehab of this property. And you can see sort of the before and after on the top photos, and then some of the after shots of the interior. Okay, churches are a huge deal, I think, across the state, and often a property type that is challenging. And I'm going to show you a couple of projects. One you saw in the video. I'm going to show you a couple of projects that are underway now or that are complete, and talk a little bit about what the opportunity is with some of these spaces. So this is St. Vladimir's. This is the church that you saw in the video, and you can see the historic photo of the church soon after it was built. It was completed in 1932. The middle photo is what the church looked like when it was purchased by the company that's going to use it as their headquarters. And then you have a couple of interior shots, which you also saw in the video. You can see when we started the project, it looked like a church, but we were able to have the project approved so that we could convert it to, office space for this company. We were required to keep the stained glass windows and some of the other windows, the yellow and green glass that you see, or sorry, yellow and blue glass that you see in the sanctuary. But we were not required to keep the pews, and we could make some alterations to adapt it for office use. The next church is Our Lady of Mercy. This is also in Tremont. This complex has a church, a rectory, and a school. The school is attached to the church, and I'll show you a couple slides of the church, or I'm sorry, of the school in just a moment. This is very dramatic office space for a company that does commercial interiors, and they use the church as their office and their showroom, and they love the space. It's some of the best office space, I think, in Cleveland. And you can see the project cost. This is the church, the rectory, and the school, so you can see the information on the entire project. But this church sat vacant for a while, and it could have easily been torn down for new development. Instead, it was repurposed for this office use. This is another project in Lakewood that is just currently applying for state tax credits. It's going in the round that is at the end of this month, next week. And it is a historic church with a 1953 classroom addition, which you can see the historic church, which had an addition itself, and then the photo today with the addition on the side. It also includes, the project also includes the two commercial buildings that you see in that shot. And this will be, the church is going to be converted to office in the sanctuary and the fellowship hall, and housing in the classroom addition. And then the commercial buildings will remain commercial, and there will be actually behind one of the commercial buildings on the side street, new construction that will include 9 more apartment units. So there'll be a total of 19 apartment units in this development. And I live in Lakewood. This is a really critical project, and this whole entire block, it's a block wide, was threatened with demolition. Somebody wanted to buy it, scrape the ground, and put in a Wendy's. And thankfully, the city of Lakewood stepped in, realizing that is not the best use of the property, and they acquired the property and are now selling it to the developer who's going to rehabilitate it. But he couldn't do it without the value of the state and federal credits. The other big property type besides schools, or besides churches, are schools. And I think that this is a challenge for many communities, especially when the state funding for facilities, I think, favors heavily new construction over rehabilitation of historic buildings. They favor building new, mega schools on the outskirts of town instead of rehabbing schools that kids can still walk and bike to. So we have been asked to deal with several schools, and it will probably, it'll probably continue to be a project and a problem. This is, again, Our Lady of Mercy. This is the school. It's a 2-story school, and I just decided to show you interior photos. We used the classroom space. We kept the historic corridor as a classroom space. The demising walls between the classroom spaces were taken out. Partial walls were put in to create offices. And this is the result. It's pretty dramatic space. And it's a, it's a small company that's on one floor. We have another company on the floor below. It's a 2-story building. So that's the particulars of that conversion. This is Central School in Amherst, Ohio, and it is now, it's been adapted and rehabilitated for senior housing and assisted living. This was the central school for Amherst for decades, and it was closed. The school was closed for about 30 years. It's now been rehabilitated, repurposed, corridors been kept, the gymnasium and auditorium are kept. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see that's the gym. The windows were all new windows were put in that matched the historic configuration, doors as well. The walking track and the corridors remain as they were. And the greatest part about this project is people who went to this school are now living there. This is a project that we're currently working on. This is St. Michael School. It's also in Tremont. It's affiliated with St. Michael Church, which is a fairly famous church in Cleveland. And there's also a convent behind the school. The school has been vacant for years. There's a heavy, there's lots of black mold growing in the building. It's really the outside is spectacular. The inside is not in such great shape. This will be rehabilitated again. The corridors and the stairs, all the circulation will be kept. The auditorium will be kept. This is going to be rehabilitated by Cleveland Housing Network or CHN Housing Partners for affordable senior housing. And it's in the process of, the federal application is in, the state tax credit application will go in. And it will, create housing for people who went to the school again. This is the second polling question. So I'm just going to close it on my screen and move on, I think. Okay, I think there's in other communities like Cleveland and surrounding areas, we have housing, some housing stock that's very large and is obsolete for a single family because of the size. So I want to show you a couple projects where a single family house was used by an organization, they left, and now it's being converted to housing for market rate or affordable, that sort of thing. So this is a, almost 24,000 square foot mansion and carriage barn in Cleveland Heights, right over University Circle. The College Club of Cleveland occupied the building. It was a single family house when they bought it in 1951. The College Club occupied it as their offices and meeting space until a couple of years ago when they sold it to a developer. The city of Cleveland Heights was very interested in the property being kept. They did not want to lose the house. The parking lot for the parking lot area for the building never had a house on it, so there was some vacant land next to it. So the developer, in this case, is rehabilitating the house and the carriage barn, putting 10 units in the house and 4 units in the carriage barn. And then there's new construction on the vacant lot. In this case, you can see the value of the credits, and this is just an example in of one of the units. So the two top photos are the old billiard room that the College Club was using for offices. And the bottom is a rendering of that same space. It's a 2-story space that has access actually on both floors from a corridor, so you don't have to move your stuff up and down the circular staircase. But it's a really good example of creating a really nice space, maintaining the historic character of the building, yet making it functional for today's living. This is also College Club. I just wanted to show you quick photos. This is a sleeping porch on the left and the dining room, former dining room on the right. The two renderings below show what those spaces will look like when the project is completed this fall. Here quickly is the West Side YWCA. This is on Franklin Boulevard in the Ohio City neighborhood. It's the same idea as the College Club. The current condition is there's a huge non-historic addition across the front of the building that connects to the dormitory buildings, which you see on the lower right. The large rooms of the house will be converted to housing market rate apartments. Empire Hotel, this is in Tiffin, Ohio. This building was built as a hotel. It's been vacant for years. It will again be a hotel, it will be a boutique hotel created in a market that has nothing like it. Large project, Cleveland Board of Education building also converted to a hotel. And then just a couple of large commercial projects, Tinnerman Steel Range Company being converted to housing, and the May Company, downtown Cleveland, almost could have been lost to demolition, and it is also being converted. And it is currently leasing units. Not-for-profit organizations can use historic tax credits. This is a list of some of them that have. And this is the last polling question, and that is the conclusion of my quick presentation.
Thank you, Heather.
Welcome.
Raises a lot of questions, but before we get to them, if possible, if we have time, I now want to introduce Jessica Powell, who runs the Hamilton County Land Bank.
All right. Can everyone hear me and see me okay?
We
Good.
can hear you.
So I have the misfortune of going after Heather, who the photos that Heather provided are amazing and exciting, because it really shows what this is all about and what the product of what I think we're all collectively trying to do at the end of the day really ideally ends up as. So I'm going to talk more about the front end of historic preservation, at least as it relates to properties that are literally falling apart and on the verge of either demolition by neglect or emergency demolition. So that's kind of the focus of my presentation, and maybe I should have gone first because, one, I wouldn't have to compete or have to go after Heather, but two, we're kind of talking about the start of preservation, at least of like the most derelict, abandoned properties in our region, which is, I'm out of Hamilton County, which is Southwest Ohio. So, you know, before I forget, I do want to say, at least on the county land banks end, all of the work that I'm going to talk about today is, it is a team effort. So on my staff, we've got folks, Liz Eddy, who does a lot of our stabilization work, Will Basil, Ron Schaus. I mean, this is not a one-man show, what I'm about to kind of describe to you. It is something that requires so much coordination, both with our internal staff as well as external contractors in the city of Cincinnati and funding partners. So I just want to throw that in, because what I'm describing is really about the work of a number of people on our side of things. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how our program works, and hopefully at the end of this presentation give you a sense of how what we do eventually transitions into the type of work that Heather and her company take on. in terms of transitioning our work onto the private market. So for our land bank, we've done a lot of these slides. Let me just preface this by saying a lot of the slides that I'm going to show you, unfortunately, have not been updated since 2018. I don't think that takes away from the message and the information I'm going to provide. But basically what I'm saying is that since a lot of these numbers and cost and other figures on here have been put together, we've done more properties, we've spent more money. So our program continues to grow since 2018, or the span that a lot of these slides cover. So we've done over 2.5 million, we're probably close to 3.5 million to date in stabilization of historic structures in Hamilton County. I think we've hit at least 30 stabilizations, even though this slide talks about 23. As of today, we've done at least 30 stabilizations of historic structures using public funding. And by public funding, what I'm talking about, and we'll get into, is land bank funds. So we use a lot of DTAC funds, which, as we all know, is the bread and butter of land bank operations. And then also a lot of our stabilizations include funding from jurisdictional partners, including the city of Cincinnati. In this block, and I'm going to talk about this towards the end, we talk about trying to do more with support from private donors. So far, our attempts to get private money, patient capital, and other funding sources in to do our work has not been successful, but we keep trying. And really, I would just say that in order to keep doing what we're doing and to do more of it, we need more funding sources, as do all of the land banks and other participants on here. And next slide. So in Hamilton County, like a lot of our kind of bigger cities and smaller cities in Ohio, we have a lot of historic structures, many of which are vacant and not being properly maintained. And so on this slide, these two pictures just give you a sense of what our program is about and sometimes where it falls short. The picture on the left is a property in Over the Rhine, which is a neighborhood in Cincinnati that has a large clusters of Italianate architecture. This particular property was vacant, ordered vacated by the city, longtime vacant property, and it fell apart. I think as between the city's code inspectors and our office and others, we all knew it was in the stage of deteriorating to a point of collapse, but this happened one night, I think, during a time of heavy rainfall that really got into the bricks. So it collapsed, and we worked with the city to quickly get in there, mobilize, and stabilize the structure on the left. The structure on the right is really just a cautionary tale that all of us know for historic stabilization. It's an old mansion that was in the North Avondale neighborhood of Cincinnati, and we actually went through it with the city of Cincinnati, abandoned property. We went through it a few years ago, and the stabilization cost was around $500,000. And between us and the city, we could not come up with the money, and it was actually demolished 2 years ago. So I would just say kind of the reason for our work, and for cities and other historic property lovers for doing this work to the most blighted of buildings, is if you don't get in to do anything, they end up getting demolished, or they demolish themselves through neglect. Next slide. This just gives you an estimate of what our average costs per square foot are to stabilize a blighted historic property. And this is just the bare base level cost to mothball a property, to make it weather tight, to deal with structural issues, and to get it just the minimal condition to be able to walk into safely and be able to see what one needs to do to bring it to the full state of habitability and occupancy that Heather really highlighted in her presentation. So the $21 per square foot, that's from a few years ago. There's no question that this cost, if we were to update it, has probably at least gone up to $30 a square foot. given the price, the kind of escalating price of construction materials and labor and so forth. So this is not an inexpensive endeavor. Next slide. And so the next few slides, if you'll bear with me, are pictureless slides that just really go through frequently asked questions about our program. So I'll try to make it as interesting as possible, but basically, I'm just going to be going over nuts and bolts, like why we do it and some of the mechanics in this next section of slides. And so the question is, what is our historic stabilization program? Basically, it's the land bank leveraging internal and external funds to stabilize blighted and vacant historic properties. Next slide. So the question is, how do we decide which properties we're going to work to stabilize in Hamilton County? And as we all know, with development work, particularly with land bank eligible properties, the demand far exceeds the resources available. So we work with an advisory board comprised of our own staff, public and local jurisdictions, as well as staff from the Cincinnati Preservation Association to help recommend properties and inform which ones might be good to apply our resources to. We also look at marketability in order to kind of keep a program like this as sustainable as possible. And sustainable is, I'm using that loosely because we're losing money on this. But we really want to see where can we find end users in neighborhoods where there's work going on and there's an opportunity for matching funds and other kind of forms of historic significance. Next slide. So we talked about how the land bank allocates DTAC funds. And we use approximately $200,000 of our DTAC funds every year to pick 2 or 3 historic vacant blighted buildings to stabilize. We also have been able to kind of go beyond that 2 or 3 stabilization per year number using matching funds from the city of Cincinnati. We've committed to raising philanthropic and grant funds to grow our resources. And like I said, to date, that has not been successful. But to give you an example of what our Port Authority, which is the entity in which our land bank is housed, has done to support other kinds of redevelopment, like our industrial redevelopment, is to work with private patient capital investors to be able to fund industrial redevelopment. So we're hoping to do something similar with our historic stabilization work, where we can get patient capital investors to be able to develop and come up with a pool of money to help us be a little bit more flexible, nimble, and able to scale up the stabilization work that we do. Next slide. So the question is why do we do this? I think I will back up and say, I think our land bank in Hamilton County was one of the first ones to really focus or prioritize at least doing a little bit of historic stabilization. And I do know that other land banks are doing it, I think, now as well. One of the impetuses behind our land bank starting our historic structure stabilization program is that it came about at a time when we were doing Moving Ohio Forward demolitions, as well as following that doing neighborhood improvement program demolitions. So like all land banks, we've done hundreds and hundreds of demolitions of blighted structures, and we were getting a lot of pushback from the community, but we also recognized that that historic structures, like demolition, is not always the answer. And I think we all recognize that. And so we wanted to contribute at least a little bit to the stabilization piece, kind of seeing that as a complement to demolition in terms of revitalization of our region. The other piece, and we're going to get into it on the next slide, but the other piece of this is that land banks, I think many of us know, are really, really uniquely positioned to be able to do this kind of work. So under state law, it's Ohio Revised Code section 715.26 and 715.261. For properties that are declared a public nuisance, cities can enter into what's called an agency agreement with their county land bank to abate those nuisances. Abatement, abatement can include anything from demolition to mowing the grass, but it also covers stabilization. So if you go to the next slide, what we do for a lot of these properties that, well, towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you specific examples. We actually use our statutory tools in partnership with the city of Cincinnati to go into properties that we don't own, but that are abandoned, and to do stabilization as an agent of the city. So this slide just shows a screenshot of sample stabilization agreement. We can provide actual copies or sample documents. If anybody want them after this presentation, just let me or Western Reserve Land Conservancy know. But this is a stabilization of a property that was declared a public nuisance by the city. Under state law and local law, the city notifies the property owner and any interested parties or lien holders that it's been declared a public nuisance. They're under an order to fix the property, and part of the notice and what state law provides is that if the owner or the lien holders do not fix it within 30 days, that the city or its agent can go onto the structure to abate the nuisance. So from that legal notice due process, when we do these, we enter into these agreements with the city. And in this one, it's not only kind of an authorization for us to abate, but there's also funding attached, CDBG funding from the city to stabilize the structure. I can't read what property it is, but to stabilize the structure in question for this document. And in our instance, a lot of times the city uses CDBG funds because in the city of Cincinnati's consolidated plan, they've identified stabilization of blighted structures and LMI census tracts as a desired use of their CDBG funding. So that's kind of what has opened the door for the city and its budgeting process to allocate some of its entitlement CDBG funds to stabilization in lieu of other types of blight abatement like demolition. Next slide. So this is like a asking a question and giving an answer that I think we all know and is the reason we're on here, which is why do we do this? We know that once a property is demolished, it totally changes the character of an area, and that a lot of the redevelopment and revitalization in our communities, a lot of it is possible only because communities and developers and jurisdictions and residents have championed the preservation of structures. So we see our role kind of as one of many. We see our role as a supporting one to kind of help keep a row or a block of properties or a neighborhood intact, and through that, putting them back into productive use. Next slide. So Heather talked a lot about getting tax credits in order to kind of finalize the rehab or restoration of a property. For our program, we don't require or we don't look to a property to have formal historic designation in order for us to consider it for stabilization. There's no question that that historic designation or even a local historic designation is huge because it gives access to federal and state tax credits, but just for our purposes, it's not a criteria. It certainly helps when we're doing our analysis, but there's lots of properties that we've done that don't meet that criteria. Next slide. So the question is what do we do as compared to say like what Heather does or what other developers do? The properties that I'm going to go over with you today and that were featured on the video, these are properties that if you had tried to walk into them prior to our stabilization, there would be areas where you would fall through the floor or areas where you could see the sky and rain was coming in. So that gives you a sense of the condition of what we're talking about. I mean, these are dangerous properties that cannot be entered without basic precautions and making sure that you're safe. And so what we're doing is we're just doing the bare minimum. I wouldn't say bare minimum because it is significant, but we're doing the stabilization that mothballs a property until further redevelopment can occur. So it's looking at gutters, new roofs, tuck pointing, dealing with structural issues, dealing with holes in the floor. And in Cincinnati and in many other jurisdictions, there's standards for dealing with vacant buildings. So in the city of Cincinnati, there's what's called a 13-point VBML standard, which stands for Vacant Building Maintenance License. And it basically just sets forth very common sense, basic criteria that have to be met to make a vacant, uninhabitable building just safe. And that's essentially what we're doing, is we're bringing buildings up to the city's VBML standards. Next slide. So after our properties are stabilized, we're getting better. Like, the question is how do we deal with it? And we've started listing properties with realtors and marketing them on social media. We also work with neighborhood partners and the Cincinnati Preservation Association to find end users. Some of our stabilizations, including the one on McMillan that was featured in our county land bank film earlier, are in areas where there's already smaller developers working. So developers know we're involved, know we own a building, and sometimes they reach out to us with proposals for redevelopment. Next slide. So this is a map. It's only as current as through 2017, but it shows just where we're doing a lot of our stabilization, and the focus is, of course, near our downtown area in Cincinnati. A lot is done in Over the Rhine, which again is it's a neighborhood. It's actually just north of downtown Cincinnati with a lot of Italianate architecture, but also other neighborhoods surrounding the center city. Next slide.
You're gonna have to wrap up in like 1 minute.
Okay.
I'm being stared at by the fearless leader himself.
Absolutely. I'm gonna just run through these in 10 seconds. So 1201 Lynn Street, we still own it. We've done actually over $600,000 in stabilization and are working with end users to get state and local tax credits, federal tax credits, new markets, and state capital funds. This is an Italianate building. Next slide. Next slide. This is an old mansion, 18 Mulberry, that was owned by Christian Moorline, who many of you know is a beer company. So it was the old Christian Moorline family house in Mount Auburn. Next slide. This is an old farmer's hotel, which is where farmers went to in Cincinnati's North Side neighborhood to sell their livestock in the city. Next slide.
Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm being told that in order to facilitate the next session, we're going to have to wrap up.
So I think not a problem. Thank you.
Yeah, there were a couple of questions we didn't get a chance to answer. You have the contact information for our speakers. I think everyone would agree this is a topic that bears further investigation, and one that really maybe will provoke some of the people attending this conference to think more about the role we can play in terms of land banks and historic preservation. I want to thank Jessica. I want to thank Heather. I want to thank the attendees for those who are getting CLE for answering the polling questions. And take care, everyone. See you at the next session.